In the cold months of early 1453, Constantinople stood like a jewel in a broken crown, magnificent and tragically alone. The city that had once commanded an empire stretching from the Atlantic shores of Spain to the sun-scorched deserts of Syria now controlled little more than its own walls and a handful of islands scattered across the Aegean like forgotten coins. For more than 1,000 years, these walls had sheltered the continuity of Roman civilization, preserving the literature and learning of antiquity while barbarian kingdoms rose and fell across Europe. Now the great metropolis found itself an island of Christianity surrounded by an Ottoman sea that lapped ever closer to its ancient stones. The emperor, who gazed out from the palace windows across his diminished realm, was Constantine XI Palaiologos, a name that carried the weight of two empires. The first Constantine had founded this city in 330 AD and made it the new Rome, the pivot upon which the ancient world would turn into something unprecedented. This last Constantine, 11 centuries later, inherited not an empire but its echo, not the glory of legions, but the duty of preservation. He was a soldier by temperament and a diplomat by necessity, crowned emperor in 1449 at the age of 44 after his brother abdicated. What he received was not truly a coronation, but the acceptance of an impossible burden. The city itself numbered perhaps 50,000 souls, where once 750,000 had crowded its streets and squares. Entire neighborhoods lay abandoned, their houses collapsing into rubble, their churches silent and empty. Vineyards and gardens grew within the circuit of walls where once dense apartment blocks had climbed the 7 hills. Shepherds grazed their flocks in forums where philosophers had debated, and emperors had received the adulation of crowds. The great hippodrome, where chariot races once inflamed partisan passions to the point of riot, now hosted only echoes and weeds pushing through cracked marble. Yet the monuments of former grandeur still stood, and they spoke of a civilization that had achieved wonders. The Hagia Sophia dominated the skyline, its massive dome seeming to float above the city as though held aloft by divine hands rather than mortal engineering. Built by Justinian 9 centuries earlier, it remained the largest cathedral in Christendom, its interior a forest of columns and a heaven of golden mosaics. The morning light streaming through its windows created an atmosphere that stunned visitors into silence and prayer. Even in decline, the great church reminded the world that Constantinople had been the center of Christian civilization, when London was a minor town and Paris was just beginning to matter. The Theodosian Walls that enclosed the city represented military engineering at its most formidable. Constructed in the 5th century under the Emperor Theodosius II, they consisted of 3 successive barriers that rose from the surrounding terrain, like stone waves frozen in time. The outer wall stood 20 feet high, backed by a second wall rising 30 feet, and finally the great inner wall that towered nearly 40 feet above its foundation. A moat 60 feet wide added yet another obstacle, though portions had silted and filled over the centuries. These fortifications stretched for 4 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, punctuated by towers that provided overlapping fields of fire for archers and artillery. For 1,000 years, these walls had turned back every army that dared approach them. Persians, Avars, Arabs, Bulgars and Russians had all broken themselves against the stones of Constantinople. The Arabs had besieged the city twice in the 7th and 8th centuries, deploying fleets of hundreds of ships and armies counted in the tens of thousands, only to withdraw in defeat. The Fourth Crusade had breached the walls in 1204, but that was treachery from supposed Christian allies rather than conquest by force of arms from a genuine enemy. No Muslim power had ever taken the city despite repeated attempts spanning 8 centuries. Constantine understood that walls alone would not save his capital. He needed soldiers to man them, and soldiers required payment. The imperial treasury held barely enough gold to maintain the court and the essential functions of government. Mercenaries required gold, and there was little to offer them. The Byzantine bureaucracy, once the most sophisticated administrative system in the world, had atrophied into a shell of scribes recording the decline they were powerless to prevent. Tax revenues had dwindled with the loss of territory, and what little wealth remained concentrated in the hands of a few aristocratic families whose commitment to the empire often wavered when their own interests seemed threatened. The emperor had spent the winter months strengthening what defenses he could. Walls were inspected and repairs ordered where crumbling stone or mortar threatened integrity. The great chain that could be stretched across the Golden Horn to prevent enemy ships from entering that natural harbour was tested and reinforced. Food stores were inventoried and supplemented where possible, though the city could not sustain a lengthy siege without resupply from the sea. Constantine sent envoys to Venice and Genoa pleading for military assistance, promising trade concessions and privileges that the empire had no real authority left to grant. The Italian maritime republics viewed Constantinople with the cold calculation of merchants assessing risk and profit. Venice maintained a colony in the city and controlled trade routes through the Bosphorus that generated considerable wealth. Genoa operated from the suburb of Galata across the Golden Horn, a semi-independent community whose merchants had grown rich from Byzantine decline. Both republics understood that an Ottoman conquest would threaten their commercial interests, yet neither wished to commit substantial military resources to defending a dying empire. Their response to Constantine's appeals was measured and inadequate. The wider Christian world offered little more than words. The Pope in Rome spoke of organizing a crusade to save Constantinople, but Europe's princes were consumed with their own rivalries and ambitions. England and France were exhausted from their 100 Years' War that had only recently concluded. The German princes squabbled among themselves, and the Holy Roman Emperor lacked the authority to compel united action. The kingdoms of Spain were pushing the final remnants of Islamic power from the Iberian Peninsula and had no interest in fighting Muslims in the east. Poland and Hungary, nearest to the Ottoman threat, had suffered catastrophic defeats in previous conflicts and hesitated to test Ottoman military power again. This isolation stemmed partly from religion and partly from politics. The Byzantine Church followed Orthodox Christianity, which had formally split from Roman Catholicism in 1054 over questions of theology and papal authority. 4 centuries of schism had hardened into mutual suspicion and resentment. Many Orthodox Christians in Constantinople despised and feared the Latin West more than they feared the Muslim East, remembering with bitterness how the Fourth Crusade had sacked their city and how Latin knights had established a crude empire atop Byzantine ruins for half a century. When Constantine explored reunion with Rome as a condition for Western military aid, he ignited a firestorm of opposition among his own people. The Emperor, John VIII, Constantine's predecessor, had travelled to Italy in 1439 and agreed to the Union of Florence, accepting papal supremacy in exchange for promises of military assistance that never materialized. The Orthodox clergy in Constantinople largely rejected this union, viewing it as a betrayal of true faith for political expediency. The division split families and monasteries, creating an atmosphere of bitter controversy at precisely the moment when unity was most essential. Constantine found himself ruling a city where many preferred Ottoman conquest to compromise with Rome, a tragic irony that hobbled his diplomatic efforts. Within the palace, Constantine held council with his advisors and commanders, men whose loyalty was certain even if their resources were limited. His brothers had departed to the Morea in southern Greece, the last substantial territory under Byzantine control, leaving him without family allies in the capital. The military forces under his direct command numbered perhaps 5,000 men, a mixture of Byzantine soldiers and foreign mercenaries. Against the army assembling beyond the horizon, this garrison was woefully inadequate. The city's aristocracy understood the mathematics of the situation. Some made quiet arrangements to secure their wealth and families should the walls fail. Others prepared to die in defense of a civilization they believed worth preserving regardless of the cost. The merchants of the Venetian and Genoese quarters weighed profit against survival, wondering whether their home republics would abandon them or send relief. The monasteries intensified their prayers and processions, carrying holy icons through the streets in elaborate ceremonies meant to invoke divine protection. The common people went about their daily lives with the fatalistic resignation of those who had survived previous crises and trusted that their walls, their faith, and their emperor would see them through once more. Beyond those walls, in the camps and gathering grounds of Thrace, an army was assembling that would test every assumption about the invincibility of Constantinople. Sultan Mehmed II, young and burning with ambition, had devoted the past 2 years to preparing for this moment. He had commissioned cannons of unprecedented size, assembled engineers and specialists from across his empire and beyond, and gathered a military force that numbered in the tens of thousands. His father had died in 1451, and the young sultan who succeeded him at age 19 was determined to achieve what all his predecessors had failed to accomplish. Constantine knew the siege was coming. Ottoman forces had already severed the city's land connections to the outside world, and the fortress of Rumeli Hisari, completed in 1452 just north of the city along the Bosphorus, controlled shipping through the straits. The noose was tightening, and the emperor could do little but prepare and pray. He inspected the walls personally, walking their length and speaking with soldiers. His presence meant to reassure and inspire. He attended services in the Hagia Sophia, kneeling before the altar where emperors had knelt for 11 centuries, asking God to protect the city one more time. The winter gave way to early spring, and with better weather came the certainty that delay was ending. Reports arrived of Ottoman troops marching toward the city, of cannons being hauled across Thrace on massive carts drawn by teams of oxen, of ships assembling in the Sea of Marmara. The people of Constantinople looked to their walls, to their emperor, and to their faith. They were the last Romans, the inheritors of a tradition stretching back through the Byzantine millennium to the age of Augustus and beyond. They stood at the edge of history, defending not just a city, but the final living connection to the ancient world. What was about to unfold would determine whether that connection survived or whether it would be severed forever, leaving only memory and legend in its place. Mehmed II was 21 years old when he decided to accomplish what 7 centuries of Islamic rulers had failed to achieve. His youth concealed a mind that worked with ruthless clarity and an ambition that accepted no boundaries. Where other sultans had been content to rule the territories they inherited, Mehmed looked at the map of his empire and saw an absurdity. The Ottoman domains stretched across Anatolia and deep into the Balkans, yet Constantinople sat between these two halves like a thorn in living flesh. The city was an island of Christian defiance that interrupted the geographical unity of Islamic power, and its continued existence offended both his strategic sense and his vision of destiny. The young sultan had studied the history of previous sieges with obsessive attention to detail. He knew that Arab armies had failed in the 8th century despite superior numbers and prolonged effort. He understood that earlier Ottoman sultans, including his own father Murad II, had attempted to take the city and withdrawn after inconclusive campaigns. Each failure had reinforced Constantinople's reputation as the city protected by God, the walls that could not fall, the place where Muslim ambitions went to die. Mehmed intended to transform that narrative into a memory of miscalculation and insufficient commitment. His personality combined intellectual curiosity with volcanic temperament. He spoke multiple languages, including Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Persian, and Latin, and he surrounded himself with scholars and artists from diverse backgrounds. He studied geometry and engineering, understanding that modern warfare required technical sophistication as much as courage. Yet this Renaissance sensibility coexisted with sudden rages and casual brutality toward those who disappointed him. His father had twice abdicated in his favor during Mehmed's childhood, only to return to power when the young ruler proved too impetuous and unpredictable. Now, with Murad II dead and Mehmed firmly established on the throne, there would be no one to restrain his ambitions or temper his methods. The first step in strangling Constantinople came in 1452 with the construction of Rumeli Hisari, the fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus. The location was chosen with precision at the narrowest point of the strait, where the distance from Europe to Asia measured less than 3/4 of a mile. Directly across the water stood Anadolu Hisari, a fortress built by Mehmed's great-grandfather Bayezid I in 1395. Together, these two fortifications could control all shipping passing between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, effectively severing Constantinople's maritime lifeline to the outside world. Mehmed personally supervised the construction, driving thousands of workers to complete the fortress in fewer than 5 months. The pace was extraordinary, the result of meticulous planning and unlimited resources thrown at the project. Stone was quarried from nearby sites and transported to the location. Engineers and architects worked from detailed plans that had been refined over the winter. The fortress rose with 4 main towers and walls 15 feet thick, positioned so that cannons could cover every approach on the water. When completed in August 1452, it stood as both a military installation and a statement of intent. The Byzantines had protested during construction, sending envoys to argue that building a fortress on Byzantine territory violated existing treaties. Mehmed ignored these protests with contempt. The fortress became operational immediately, and the Sultan appointed a garrison with orders to sink any ship attempting to pass without permission. Several Venetian vessels tested these orders in November 1452, and Ottoman cannons fired on them, sinking one and forcing the others to turn back. The captain of the sunken ship was taken to Mehmed, who ordered him beheaded and his body impaled as a warning. The message was understood throughout the city. Constantinople could no longer receive supplies or reinforcements by sea without Ottoman approval. The siege had effectively begun even before the army arrived at the walls. While the fortress took shape, Mehmed pursued another project that would revolutionize siege warfare. A Hungarian engineer named Orban appeared at his court in the winter of 1452, offering to cast cannons larger than any previously constructed. Orban had initially approached Constantine in Constantinople, proposing to build artillery for the city's defense. The emperor lacked the gold to pay him and the facilities to support his work, so the engineer crossed over to the Ottoman side, where resources were abundant and ambition matched his own technical audacity. Mehmed embraced the proposal with enthusiasm and provided Orban with unlimited funding and workforce. The Hungarian established foundries at Adrianople, the Ottoman capital, and began the complex process of casting bronze cannons of unprecedented dimensions. The largest of these weapons measured 27 feet in length with a barrel diameter of 30 inches. It could fire stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds, projectiles large enough to shatter the strongest masonry. The technical challenges were immense, from creating molds capable of withstanding the heat to transporting the finished cannon across rough terrain to Constantinople. The great cannon required 3 months to cast and emerged from the foundry in January 1453. Test firing shook the ground and shattered windows in Adrianople, prompting Mehmed to send messengers ahead to warn pregnant women and those with weak hearts to leave the area. The sound could be heard for miles, a thunder that announced the arrival of a new age in warfare. When the stone ball struck the test target, it demolished the fortification completely, leaving observers stunned at the destructive power. Traditional castle walls built to withstand battering rams and catapults had no answer to weapons of this magnitude. Transporting the cannon to Constantinople became an engineering challenge almost equal to casting it. The weapon weighed nearly 20 tons and required a specially built carriage. Teams of oxen, eventually numbering over 60, pulled the cannon slowly across Thrace while hundreds of men smoothed the road ahead, bridged streams, and reinforced weak ground. The convoy moved at barely 2 miles per day, but Mehmed was willing to invest the time. Orban cast additional cannons of smaller size but still formidable power, creating an artillery train that numbered over 70 guns of various calibers. Some could be moved and positioned quickly, while others required permanent emplacements once they arrived at the siege lines. The army assembling to accompany these cannons represented a mobilization of unprecedented scale. Mehmed summoned contingents from across his empire, drawing on the resources of Anatolia, the Balkans, and vassal territories. Estimates of the total force varied wildly, with some chronicles claiming 200,000 men or more, though such figures were certainly exaggerated. Modern historians suggest the actual number was between 80,000 and 120,000 troops, still an enormous host by any measure, and vastly outnumbering the defenders. The core of this army consisted of the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that formed the Sultan's household troops. These men had been recruited as boys through the Devshirme system, taken from Christian families in the Balkans, and raised as Muslims within a military brotherhood that demanded absolute loyalty to the Sultan. They trained constantly, maintained strict discipline, and received regular pay that made them professional soldiers rather than seasonal warriors. Their numbers had grown to approximately 12,000 by 1453, and they represented the finest infantry force in the world at that time. Armed with arquebuses, bows, and swords, the Janissaries could deliver firepower and then close for hand-to-hand combat with equal effectiveness. Beyond the Janissaries came the Anatolian and Balkan cavalry, provincial troops who owed military service in exchange for land grants. These Sipahis brought their own equipment and followers, creating a feudal military system that could field tens of thousands of horsemen. While less disciplined than the Janissaries, they provided mobility and numbers. Infantry from various regions supplemented the regular forces, along with irregular troops called bashi-bazouks, who served without pay but expected to profit from plunder. Artillery crews, engineers, miners, and support personnel swelled the total further. Mehmed also assembled a fleet to blockade Constantinople from the sea. Over 100 ships gathered in the Sea of Marmara, including large galleys with cannon mounted on their decks and smaller vessels for transport and patrol. The Admiral Süleyman Baltoglu commanded this fleet with orders to prevent any relief from reaching the city by water. While the Ottoman navy could not match the naval traditions of Venice or Genoa, it had enough strength to impose a blockade and contest control of the waters surrounding Constantinople. The psychological preparation matched the physical mobilization. Mehmed declared that the conquest of Constantinople was a religious duty, invoking prophecies attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that praised the commander who would take the city. He promised his soldiers 3 days of unrestricted plunder should the walls be breached, a traditional incentive that transformed the campaign into a potential source of enormous personal wealth for every participant. The religious scholars traveling with the army preached that dying in the siege would grant immediate entry to paradise, making casualties in the assault a pathway to eternal reward. In March 1453, the various contingents began their march toward Constantinople. The great cannon proceeded slowly at the center of this movement, while cavalry and infantry flowed around it like a human flood. scouts ranged ahead, securing routes and clearing any potential resistance. The sheer scale of the mobilization was meant to intimidate as much as to provide military capability. Refugees fleeing ahead of the army brought reports to Constantinople of an unstoppable force approaching, of cannons beyond imagination, of troops without number. These reports served Mehmed's purposes perfectly by eroding morale within the city before a single shot was fired. The Sultan himself rode with his army, visible to his troops and projecting confidence in the inevitable outcome. He had staked his reputation and considerable resources on this campaign, and failure was not something he was prepared to accept. He carried with him not only weapons and soldiers, but also architects to redesign the city after its conquest, administrators to organize its governance, and religious officials to convert its churches into mosques. He approached the siege not as a gamble, but as a certainty requiring only proper execution. As the Ottoman host drew near to Constantinople in early April, the defenders watched from their walls with growing dread. The reports had been accurate. The army that spread across the landscape outside the city exceeded anything in living memory. The great cannons took positions facing the walls, their bronze barrels catching the spring sunlight. Tents and camps extended as far as eyes could see, and the banners of Islam flew from countless poles. Mehmed established his headquarters in a richly decorated tent positioned where he could observe the walls and direct operations. The siege was about to begin in earnest, and both sides understood that what happened in the coming weeks would reshape the world. On Friday, April 6, 1453, the Ottoman army completed its encirclement of Constantinople, and the siege officially began. Mehmed positioned his forces with methodical precision, dividing the land walls into sectors and assigning specific units to each position. His own command tent stood opposite the central section of the Theodosian Walls, approximately a quarter-mile from the fortifications, close enough to observe operations, but distant enough to remain safe from Byzantine artillery. The Janissaries took position in the center, the place of honor in Ottoman military tradition, and the sector that would bear the heaviest fighting. Provincial troops extended the lines north and south, covering the entire 4-mile stretch of walls from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. The sight that confronted the defenders was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of tents transformed the landscape into a vast canvas city that sprawled across the fields and hills beyond the walls. Cooking fires numbered in the thousands, their smoke rising into the spring air. The sound of an army in motion carried across the moat, a constant background noise of voices, animal sounds, hammering, and movement. Ottoman engineers began constructing siege works, digging trenches that would allow troops to approach the walls under cover, building wooden towers that could provide elevated firing positions, and preparing emplacements for the artillery that would soon begin its terrible work. The walls themselves stood as they had for 1,000 years, massive and seemingly impregnable. The outer wall, though lower than its companions, was thick enough to resist battering rams and provided the first obstacle to any assault. Behind it, separated by a terrace called the Peribolos, rose the second wall with its own towers and fighting platforms. The great inner wall loomed highest of all, 40 feet of limestone blocks fitted together with such skill that mortar seemed almost unnecessary. These towers dotted this wall at regular intervals, each one rising another 20 feet above the battlements and providing defensive positions from which archers and artillery could command the approaches. The moat that fronted the entire system added yet another barrier, though centuries of neglect had allowed portions to fill with debris and vegetation. Constantine divided his meager forces across the walls with painful awareness that he lacked sufficient men to defend all sectors simultaneously. The total garrison numbered approximately 7,000 soldiers, including Greek regulars, foreign mercenaries, and armed citizens who volunteered for the defense. This force had to cover not only the 4 miles of land walls but also the sea walls along the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, stretches that were less formidable but still required manning. Simple mathematics revealed the crisis. Against an army of 80,000 or more, the defenders were outnumbered more than 10 to 1. Into this desperate situation sailed a vessel that brought hope mixed with realism. On April 9th, a ship arrived from Genoa, carrying Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a professional soldier whose reputation preceded him. Giustiniani commanded 700 well-equipped and battle-hardened troops, elite mercenaries whose presence would significantly strengthen the defense. More valuable than the soldiers was Giustiniani himself, a veteran of siege warfare who understood modern military engineering and possessed the tactical acumen to direct a defense against superior numbers. Constantine welcomed him with profound relief and immediately appointed him commander of the land walls, granting him authority over both Byzantine and foreign troops in that crucial sector. Giustiniani surveyed the fortifications with a professional eye and recognized both their strengths and vulnerabilities. The walls were indeed formidable, but they had been designed centuries earlier to withstand armies equipped with battering rams, catapults, and scaling ladders. The Ottoman cannons represented a threat that the ancient engineers could not have anticipated. The Genoese commander ordered immediate repairs to sections showing damage from age and weather. He organized the defenders into rotating shifts that would allow some rest while maintaining continuous manning of the battlements. Most critically, he identified the most vulnerable points along the walls and concentrated forces at those locations, particularly the Mesoteikion. The middle section of the land walls, where the valley floor brought the terrain closest to equal height with the fortifications. The defense of the sea walls required different considerations. Along the Golden Horn, the Great Chain provided the primary protection. This massive barrier consisted of iron links thick as a man's arm, stretched across the mouth of the harbour from Constantinople to the tower in Galata on the opposite shore. When raised, the chain prevented any vessel from entering the Golden Horn, forcing Ottoman ships to remain in the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara. The chain had been tested and found sound, and it gave the defenders confidence that at least one flank was secure. Venetian and Genoese ships anchored within the Golden Horn added to this maritime defense, their crews ready to repel any attempt to force the barrier. The Sea of Marmara side presented a more complex challenge. These walls were lower and less robust than the Theodosian fortifications, built for a different purpose when the sea itself provided natural defense against most armies. Ottoman ships patrolled these waters, though they had not yet attempted a direct assault. Constantine stationed soldiers along these walls but kept the numbers minimal, gambling that the main threat would come against the land walls where Mehmed had concentrated his army. It was a calculated risk born of necessity rather than preference. On April 12th, the great cannon fired for the first time against the walls of Constantinople. The sound was unlike anything the defenders had experienced, a crack of thunder that echoed across the city and sent flocks of birds erupting from their roosts in panic. The stone ball arced through the air and struck the outer wall with devastating impact, shattering the ancient stones and sending fragments flying in all directions. The wall did not collapse immediately, but a visible crack appeared in the masonry, and dust rose from the point of impact. The psychological effect was perhaps greater than the physical damage. These walls had stood for a millennium, and now they were visibly wounded within hours of the siege's beginning. Auburn's monster cannon could fire only a few times per day, due to the heat generated and the time required to reload such an enormous weapon. Each firing required teams of men working for hours, swabbing the barrel, carefully measuring the gunpowder charge, positioning the stone ball, and aiming the weapon with adjustments to the carriage. Yet those few shots per day accumulated into significant destruction. Other smaller cannons maintained a more regular rate of fire, pounding different sections of the walls with projectiles ranging from a few dozen pounds to several hundred. The bombardment established a rhythm that would continue for weeks, a relentless drumbeat of destruction that tested the defenders' nerves as much as their fortifications. The Byzantine artillerists attempted to respond with their own cannons, but their weapons were far smaller and less numerous than the Ottoman artillery. Several attempts to silence the great cannon resulted in Byzantine guns destroying themselves under the strain of firing, the castings unable to withstand the pressures generated. The Byzantines achieved some successes against Ottoman positions, killing crews and damaging siege works, but the disparity in firepower was crushing. For every shot the defenders fired, the Ottomans answered with dozens. After the initial bombardment, Mehmed ordered the first direct assault on April 18th. This probe was designed more to test the defenses than to achieve a breakthrough, sending irregular troops forward to gauge Byzantine responses and identify weak points. The attackers advanced with scaling ladders and grappling hooks, scrambling across the partially filled moat and attempting to climb the outer wall, while archers and arquebusiers provided covering fire. The defenders met them with volleys of arrows, crossbow bolts, and stones dropped from the battlements. Greek fire, the legendary Byzantine weapon of burning liquid that had destroyed Arab fleets centuries earlier, was deployed from siphons mounted on the walls, spraying flames that transformed attackers into human torches. The assault lasted several hours before Mehmed recalled his troops. They had gained nothing except casualties and the knowledge that the defenders were alert, organized, and willing to fight. The Byzantines counted their own dead and wounded, smaller numbers than the attackers, but still painful losses from a garrison that could afford none. Giustiniani moved among the soldiers after the fighting ended, praising their courage and pointing out where the defense had worked well. He also identified problems, places where the walls were inadequately manned or where the troops had responded too slowly to developing threats. Life within the city adapted to the rhythms of siege. Each day began with prayers in the churches, the population seeking divine intervention for their survival. The Hagia Sophia became the spiritual center of the defense, its vast interior filled with citizens attending the liturgy, lighting candles before icons, and participating in processions that wound through the streets carrying sacred relics. The patriarch led these observances, his voice rising in ancient prayers that generations of Byzantines had recited in times of crisis. The presence of Orthodox and Catholic Christians worshipping side by side reflected the desperate circumstances that temporarily bridged theological divisions. Food supplies became a concern from the beginning. The city had stockpiled grain and other staples, but with the land routes severed and the sea blockaded, no resupply would arrive unless relief ships broke through the Ottoman fleet. Rations were imposed, with bread distributed according to need and status. Merchants who might normally hoard goods for profit found their warehouses inventoried by imperial officials who requisitioned supplies for the common defense. Gardens within the city received intensive cultivation, and any space that could produce vegetables was planted. Fishermen continued to work the waters of the Golden Horn, though they remained behind the protective chain and ventured out only when Ottoman patrols were absent. The nights brought different anxieties. Ottoman troops worked under cover of darkness to advance their siege lines, filling portions of the moat with earth and rubble, constructing wooden screens behind which artillery could be positioned closer to the walls, and digging the trenches that would allow protected approaches for future assaults. Byzantine defenders made sorties to disrupt this work, small groups slipping out through concealed gates to attack the working parties with sudden violence before withdrawing back behind the walls. These night actions claimed casualties on both sides and added exhaustion to the defenders' burdens, but they were necessary to slow Ottoman preparations. Constantine walked the walls each day, making himself visible to his soldiers and sharing in their dangers. He wore armor like any fighting man and refused the comfort of the palace while his troops faced death on the battlements. His presence inspired loyalty and determination, a reminder that they fought not for some distant autocrat but for an emperor who stood beside them. When Justiniani suggested that he remain more protected, Constantine declined with the observation that an emperor who hid while his city fought would not be worth defending. The Genoese commander himself exemplified leadership through action. He positioned himself at the most threatened section of the walls, the Mesotikion, where the Ottoman bombardment concentrated. His distinctive armor and banner made him easily visible, and his voice carried across the battlements as he directed the defense with professional competence. The Italian mercenaries looked to him for orders, and the Greek soldiers, initially uncertain about serving under a foreigner, came to respect his abilities and follow his commands without hesitation. As April progressed, the bombardment continued without pause. Each day the great cannon fired its handful of massive shots, each one striking the walls with destructive force. The defenders worked frantically at night to repair the damage, bringing stones and timber to shore up the weakened sections, packing earth behind the walls to absorb future impacts, and constructing wooden palisades to block breaches. The work was exhausting and dangerous, performed while Ottoman snipers fired at any visible movement and while knowing that dawn would bring renewed bombardment that might undo all their efforts. The outer walls suffered most severely, with entire sections collapsing into rubble by the end of the month. Yet the defenders adapted, building barriers behind the breaks and preparing to contest any advance through the wreckage. The second wall and the great inner fortification remained largely intact, their greater mass and thickness providing resilience against even the monstrous projectiles. The Ottomans were making progress, but progress measured in yards gained at the cost of weeks of effort and uncounted tons of gunpowder. The question was whether the walls would fail before Ottoman patience and resources were exhausted. Standing on those ancient battlements, watching the enemy armies stretch to the horizon, the defenders understood that time was not their ally. The Golden Horn represented Constantinople's greatest natural advantage, a deep-water harbour that curved along the northern edge of the city for nearly 4 miles. Protected by the Great Chain and by geography that limited approach routes, this inlet had sheltered Byzantine and Allied fleets for centuries. The chain itself inspired confidence, a tangible barrier that had never been breached by force. Behind this protection rested the Christian fleet, a mixed squadron of Venetian, Genoese, and Byzantine vessels, numbering around 24 warships plus numerous smaller craft. These ships could move freely within the harbour, supporting the defence of the sea walls, transporting supplies and troops to threatened sectors, and maintaining the option to sail out for naval combat should circumstances favour such action. Mehmed understood that the Golden Horn represented a strategic problem that limited his options. His army controlled the land approaches completely, and his fleet dominated the Sea of Marmara and the Bosphorus, yet the defenders retained secure waters where his ships could not reach them. The walls along the Golden Horn were lower and less formidable than the Theodosian fortifications, manned by fewer troops, because the chain made attack from that direction seem impossible. If Ottoman ships could somehow enter the Golden Horn, they could threaten this vulnerable flank, force Constantine to divide his already inadequate garrison, and potentially provide landing points for troops who could attack the walls from within the harbour. The problem was the chain. Direct assault on this barrier would require naval forces to approach under fire from both the Constantinople walls and the Genoese colony of Galata, which maintained theoretical neutrality, but would likely oppose any attack threatening the ships sheltered behind the chain. Even if Ottoman vessels managed to reach the barrier, breaking or cutting the massive iron links would require time and expose the attackers to devastating fire from the defending ships. Previous Ottoman attempts to force entry into the Golden Horn had failed, and Mehmed needed a solution that avoided a straightforward naval battle he might not win. The solution he conceived was so audacious that his own officers initially doubted its feasibility. Behind Galata, The land rose in hills that separated the Bosphorus from the Golden Horn. The distance from the Ottoman-controlled waters of the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn measured approximately a mile over this terrain. Mehmed proposed to drag his ships overland across this obstacle, bypassing the chain entirely and introducing his fleet into the harbour from an unexpected direction. The plan required constructing a road of greased wooden tracks, building cradles to support the ships out of water, and employing teams of oxen and men to haul vessels weighing many tons up slopes and down into the harbour beyond. Engineers and shipwrights studied the route and declared the plan theoretically possible, though extraordinarily difficult. The path would need to ascend steep slopes and navigate irregular terrain while supporting the weight of galleys designed to float rather than roll on land. Trees were felled and shaped into logs that could serve as rollers, and these logs were coated with animal fat and soap to reduce friction. Wooden cradles were built to support each ship's hull and distribute weight across multiple rollers. The road itself was graded and leveled as much as possible, though the hills could not be eliminated entirely and would require immense pulling power to overcome. On the night of April 21st and into the early morning of April 22nd, the operation began. The Ottoman crews selected lighter vessels first, testing the system with ships that could be managed most easily. Teams of oxen were hitched to the cradles, and hundreds of men added their strength to ropes attached to the ships. Slowly, with much effort and adjustment, the first galley emerged from the Bosphorus onto the wooden track. The logs rolled beneath its weight, the greased surface allowing motion, though progress measured in yards per hour. Crews of workers moved the rear rollers to the front as the ship advanced, creating a continuously renewing road surface. The route climbed behind Galata, and here the real challenge emerged. The slopes required enormous pulling force, and crews strained against the ropes while drivers goaded the oxen forward. The ships tilted at alarming angles, and more than once a vessel threatened to slip from its cradle or crush the rollers beneath it. Yet Mehmed had planned for such difficulties, positioning supervisors along the route who could direct additional workers to problem areas and make immediate adjustments. Drums beat to coordinate the pulling efforts, and flags signaled when to heave and when to pause for repositioning. By dawn, the first ships were cresting the hills and beginning their descent toward the Golden Horn. The defenders watching from the Constantinople walls could scarcely believe what they witnessed. Ottoman galleys appearing to sail across land, their masts and rigging visible above the hills, moving where no ships should exist. The sight was so unexpected and seemingly impossible that initial reports were dismissed as confusion or exaggeration. Only when more ships appeared did the full scope of Mehmed's achievement become undeniable. Over the following days, approximately 70 Ottoman vessels made the passage. Not all were large warships. Many were smaller craft, including cargo ships and transports. Yet the number was sufficient to establish Ottoman naval presence within the Golden Horn and fundamentally alter the strategic situation. The ships that completed the overland journey entered the harbour waters from the north behind Galata, in an area the defenders had considered absolutely secure. Suddenly the Golden Horn was contested waters, and the walls along this flank faced imminent threat. The psychological impact exceeded even the military consequences. The operation demonstrated Ottoman technical capability and determination in ways that words alone could never convey. If Mehmed could accomplish the seemingly impossible feat of moving a fleet across land, what else might he achieve? The defenders felt the walls themselves become less certain, the siege less survivable. Morale, already strained by weeks of bombardment and isolation, suffered another blow. Constantine faced an immediate crisis of resource allocation. The Golden Horn walls now required significant reinforcement, drawing troops from sectors already undermanned. The decision of where to position his scarce soldiers became an agonizing calculation of risk. Weakening the land walls invited breakthrough where the main Ottoman army concentrated. Leaving the Golden Horn walls lightly defended invited amphibious assault from the newly introduced fleet. There was no good option, only choices between different degrees of danger. Giustiniani counselled maintaining strength at the Theodosian Walls where the primary threat remained, arguing that the Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn could harass but not independently breach the defences. Others urged Constantine to treat the new threat as equally serious, pointing out that the sea walls were far less formidable and that Ottoman troops landing within the harbour could attack the city from within. The emperor attempted compromise, shifting some troops to the Golden Horn defences while maintaining adequate strength at the land walls, but compromise meant that neither sector received sufficient force for complete security. The Venetian and Genoese captains whose ships sheltered in the Golden Horn debated whether to attack the Ottoman vessels before they could organize for offensive operations. A night assault might destroy or damage many of the enemy ships while they were still being positioned and armed. Yet such an attack would risk the Christian fleet in waters now patrolled by enemy vessels, and losses would eliminate any reserve naval strength. The debate consumed valuable time, and when the Christians finally attempted a limited attack, they found the Ottoman ships well defended and supported by shore-based artillery. The engagement was inconclusive, with both sides claiming success, but neither achieving decisive advantage. Meanwhile, the great cannon continued its methodical destruction of the Theodosian Walls. Each firing sent tremors through the ground that could be felt throughout the city. Citizens learned to recognize the preparations for firing, the sudden silence as crews completed loading, and then the thunderous crack, followed seconds later by the crash of stone against stone. The sound became the auditory signature of the siege, a recurring reminder that the walls were mortal and that time worked against the defenders. The damage accumulated day by day. The outer wall showed massive gaps where sections had collapsed entirely, the rubble piling at the base of the fortifications. The second wall suffered as well, with cracks appearing in towers and sections of battlement crumbling under repeated impacts. Only the great inner wall remained largely intact, though even this ultimate barrier showed signs of distress where the largest projectiles struck. The defenders worked through each night in desperate repair efforts, hauling timber and stones, building earthworks and wooden palisades, trying to restore what daylight and Ottoman artillery would destroy again tomorrow. The physical labor exhausted troops who were already operating on insufficient sleep and diminishing rations. Men stood watch on the walls for hours at a time, then worked repair crews through the night, then returned to defensive positions as dawn brought renewed bombardment and the possibility of assault. Casualties from the bombardment were surprisingly light given the volume of fire, since the defenders learned to take cover during the worst of the artillery barrages. Yet exhaustion became its own casualty creator, with men making mistakes from fatigue or falling asleep at their posts. Food supplies diminished despite rationing. The city's population, though reduced from its ancient numbers, still required feeding, and the siege had cut off all supply routes. Fish from the Golden Horn helped supplement the grain stores, but fish alone could not sustain the population. Prices for food in the markets rose dramatically as merchants exploited scarcity, prompting Constantine to impose price controls and threaten severe punishment for hoarding. The spectre of hunger loomed as a threat potentially more dangerous than Ottoman assault. Religious observances intensified as the siege progressed. Processions wound through the streets daily, carrying sacred icons and relics believed to possess protective powers. The most venerated of these was the Hodegetria, an icon of the Virgin Mary attributed to St. Luke himself and credited with saving the city in previous sieges. Citizens touched the icon as it passed, seeking blessing and protection, praying that the Mother of God would once again shield Constantinople from destruction. The Patriarch preached sermons emphasizing divine favor and the righteousness of defending Christendom against Islam, messages meant to sustain morale when material circumstances offered little encouragement. Yet the theological controversy over union with Rome continued to simmer even amid the siege. Many Orthodox Christians refused to attend services where Catholic prayers were recited or where the Pope's authority was acknowledged. Some declared openly that they would rather see the Turkish turban in the city than the Latin mitre, preferring Muslim conquest to submission to Roman religious authority. This division weakened unity at the worst possible moment, creating internal tensions that diverted attention from the external threat. Mehmed, observing from his command tent, noted the progress with satisfaction. His cannon was performing as promised, systematically dismantling fortifications that had stood for a millennium. His fleet now operated in the Golden Horn, threatening a flank the defenders had considered secure. His army remained strong and well supplied, while the city showed signs of increasing strain. The siege was progressing according to plan, and the outcome seemed increasingly certain. The Sultan sent envoys to Constantine with a final offer in late April. Surrender the city, and the population would be allowed to leave safely with their portable possessions. Constantine could rule the Peloponnese as an Ottoman vassal, maintaining his title and authority in that reduced domain. Alternatively, the emperor could accept an annual tribute and Ottoman suzerainty while remaining in Constantinople. The offer was generous by the standards of siege warfare, allowing both sides to claim partial victory without the devastation that would come from assault. Constantine received the envoys with courtesy and rejected the terms with firmness. He would not surrender the city that had been entrusted to his care. He would not be the emperor who ended Rome's continuity. He would defend Constantinople to the last, and if God willed its fall, then he would die with his people and his duty fulfilled. The envoys returned to Mehmed with this answer, and the Sultan expressed no surprise. He had offered terms because custom demanded it, not because he expected acceptance. Now the siege would continue to its inevitable conclusion, and when the walls finally fell, there would be no mercy. The bombardment entered its second month with a rhythm that shaped life within Constantinople. Dawn brought the first cannon shots, the crews having worked through the night to clean and reload their weapons. The great cannon fired perhaps 3 or 4 times each day, each shot requiring hours of preparation and generating heat that necessitated long pauses. The smaller artillery pieces maintained a more constant barrage, varying their targets to prevent the defenders from concentrating repairs on any single location. By dusk, the firing would diminish as visibility faded, though it never ceased entirely. Ottoman gunners launched occasional night shots, partly to maintain pressure and partly to disrupt the repair work they knew was occurring under cover of darkness. The Theodosian Walls, which had withstood every siege for 11 centuries, were visibly dying. The outer wall existed now only in fragments, entire sections reduced to piles of shattered stone that filled the moat and created ramps an attacking force could ascend. The second wall showed massive damage, with towers collapsed and long stretches of battlement torn away. Even the great inner wall, that final monumental barrier, displayed wounds that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, and whole blocks of limestone had been dislodged by the hammering impacts of stone projectiles weighing half a ton or more. The defenders responded with desperate ingenuity born of necessity. Each night, work crews emerged onto the walls and into the dangerous ground beyond them. They carried timber, stones salvaged from damaged buildings, earth in baskets, barrels filled with rocks, and anything else that might serve to repair or reinforce the fortifications. Where walls had collapsed entirely, they built wooden palisades and packed earth behind them to create improvised barriers. Where cracks appeared, they drove timber beams into the gaps and mortared stones around them. The work was exhausting and conducted under constant danger, with Ottoman snipers firing at any visible movement and occasional artillery shots seeking to catch repair parties in the open. These repairs bought time but could not restore the walls to their former strength. The bombardment would resume at dawn, and the newly repaired sections would face the same destructive force that had demolished them originally. Yet the work continued because stopping meant immediate defeat. Every night that the walls remained standing, even in damaged form, was another night the city survived. Every dawn that found barriers in place, however improvised, was another day Constantinople could hope for relief or miracle. The fighting below ground added another dimension to the siege. Ottoman engineers began digging mines toward the walls in early May, tunneling beneath the surface to reach the foundations of the fortifications. The goal was to excavate chambers beneath the walls, shore them with timber, and then burn the supports. When the timbers collapsed, the wall section above would fall into the void, creating breaches far more extensive than bombardment alone could achieve. This technique had proven effective in other sieges, and Mehmed employed engineers experienced in mining operations. The Byzantines countered with German and Scottish mining experts who understood how to detect and intercept these tunnels. They placed bronze bowls of water on the ground at regular intervals along the interior of the walls, watching for ripples that would indicate underground digging. They also dug countermines, tunneling toward the Ottoman excavations with the intent of breaking into them, flooding them, or fighting the enemy miners in the claustrophobic darkness beneath the earth. When Byzantine countermines intersected Ottoman tunnels, vicious hand-to-hand combat erupted in spaces so confined that men could barely swing their weapons. Several times the defenders succeeded in destroying Ottoman mines before they could be completed. They would break into a tunnel, fight through the guards, and either collapse the excavation or set fire to the supports prematurely, burying enemy miners in the process. Other times, the Ottomans detected the countermining efforts and flooded the Byzantine tunnels or collapsed them with their own demolitions. This subterranean war claimed casualties on both sides and added another layer of stress to defenders already stretched beyond their limits. The exhaustion became cumulative and crushing. Soldiers rotated between the walls, the repair crews, and rest periods that were never long enough. A man might spend 4 hours on the battlements watching for assault, then 4 hours hauling stones for repairs, then perhaps 4 hours of sleep before returning to the walls. This cycle repeated day after day, and the human body and mind could not sustain such strain indefinitely. Men fell asleep standing up, jerked awake by the crash of artillery. They moved with the slow mechanical movements of the profoundly weary, and mistakes multiplied. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and alertness among troops who had been pushed past normal human endurance. Giustiniani rotated his Italian mercenaries as much as possible, but even these professional soldiers showed the effects of extended siege conditions. The Byzantine soldiers defending their own city and families found motivation in personal stakes, but motivation alone could not overcome physical limits. Constantine moved among them constantly, his presence providing encouragement. Yet even the emperor could not grant the rest and relief they desperately needed. Food scarcity progressed from concern to crisis as May advanced. The stockpiled grain dwindled toward dangerously low levels despite strict rationing. Fish from the Golden Horn helped, but the Ottoman naval presence made fishing more dangerous and less productive. Gardens within the city produced vegetables, but not in quantities sufficient for a population that still numbered in the tens of thousands. Citizens began eating horses, then dogs, then cats. Hunger gnawed at rich and poor alike, though the wealthy could purchase the increasingly scarce food at prices beyond the reach of common people. Constantine ordered the remaining food stocks inventoried and imposed even stricter rationing, reserving larger portions for the soldiers on the walls, who required strength to fight. This prioritization was militarily necessary but socially divisive, as starving civilians watched soldiers receive double rations. The emperor also ordered that wealthy families open their stores to the city, requisitioning hoarded supplies with promises of compensation after the siege lifted. These promises rang hollow to merchants who doubted there would be an after for Constantinople. In mid-May, hope arrived in the form of a rumor that grew into conviction. Venetian relief ships were sailing from the Adriatic, carrying soldiers and supplies that would break the siege. The story spread through the city with the speed of desperate desire, amplified by each retelling until people spoke with certainty about the massive fleet approaching. Constantinople need only hold out a few more days and salvation would arrive. The defenders found renewed energy in this hope, working harder at repairs, standing their watches with renewed vigilance, imagining the Ottoman army's retreat when Christian reinforcements made the siege untenable. Constantine knew better than to believe rumors, but he allowed the hope to spread because morale required something to sustain it. He sent scouts to watch from the highest towers for any sign of ships on the horizon. Days passed with no sighting, and then a week. The hope began to fade as reality reasserted itself. No massive fleet was coming. Venice had its own interests to consider, and committing major resources to defend a dying empire made no commercial or political sense. The city was alone, as it had been from the beginning. On May 3rd, 3 Genoese ships and 1 Byzantine vessel attempted to reach the city through the Ottoman naval blockade. These were not the phantom Venetian armada of rumor, but real ships carrying grain and weapons purchased with funds Constantine had desperately scraped together. They sailed northward through the Sea of Marmara toward the city, their appearance visible to both defenders and besiegers. The Ottoman fleet, commanded by Admiral Süleyman Baltoglu, moved to intercept with overwhelming numbers. What followed was a naval battle fought within sight of both armies and the entire population of Constantinople. The 4 Christian ships, larger and heavier than the Ottoman galleys, formed a defensive cluster and fought through the Turkish fleet. The wind favored the defenders initially, allowing the sailing ships to use their height advantage to rain projectiles down onto the Ottoman galleys. Greek fire sprayed from the Christian ships, turning several Turkish vessels into floating pyres. Yet the Ottoman numbers told, with dozens of galleys surrounding the Christian ships, their crews attempting to board, while archers fired clouds of arrows at the defenders. The battle lasted for hours, drifting closer to the city as the wind carried the struggling mass of ships. Thousands watched from the walls and from Mehmed's camp, the outcome uncertain and vitally important to both sides. If the relief ships reached Constantinople, they would bring not only supplies, but proof that the blockade could be broken and that further relief might follow. If the Ottoman fleet captured or sank them, the defenders would know with finality that no help was coming. The Christian ships fought magnificently, their crews displaying seamanship and courage that won admiration even from their enemies. As evening approached, the wind shifted and began blowing toward the city. The Ottoman galleys, dependent on oars, could not prevent the sailing ships from using this wind to escape. The 4 vessels broke free of the encirclement and sailed into the Golden Horn, cheered by the defenders lining the walls. The supplies they carried were modest and would not solve the food crisis, but their arrival demonstrated that the siege was not yet completely sealed. Mehmed was furious at the naval failure and summoned Admiral Baltoglu to explain how 4 ships had escaped a fleet of over 100 vessels. The Sultan's rage was volcanic, and he ordered the Admiral Bastinado beaten on the soles of his feet. Baltoglu was fortunate to escape with his life and his position, though his authority was permanently diminished. The incident revealed the limits of Ottoman naval capabilities and provided the defenders with a small but significant psychological victory after weeks of unrelenting pressure. Yet 4 ships could not change the fundamental mathematics of the siege. The supplies they brought would feed the city for days, not weeks. No additional relief appeared on the horizon despite continued watching. The Ottomans tightened their blockade, stung by the escape and determined to prevent any repetition. The defenders consumed the grain and weapons from the relief ships and found themselves still besieged, still outnumbered, still enduring bombardment that never stopped. The assaults against the walls intensified as May progressed. These were not yet the final assault, but rather probing attacks meant to test specific sections, exhaust the defenders, and create conditions for the ultimate storm. Ottoman troops would advance in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying ladders and grappling hooks, attempting to scale the walls before defenders could fully mobilize. The alarm bells would ring through the city, and men would scramble to their positions, rushing toward whatever sector faced attack. The fighting would rage for an hour or two, then the Ottomans would withdraw, leaving casualties on both sides and adding to the exhaustion that made each subsequent defense more difficult. These dawn assaults became routine, expected each morning like the sunrise itself. The defenders slept in their armor, weapons close at hand, knowing the alarm could sound at any moment. This constant state of readiness prevented genuine rest and added psychological strain to the physical exhaustion. Men lived in perpetual anticipation of violence, unable to relax, even during the brief periods away from the walls. The city's appearance reflected the siege's toll. Buildings showed damage from stray artillery shots that had cleared the walls. Smoke from fires hung in the air, some from normal cooking, but others from structures damaged in the bombardment. The streets were quieter than normal, with citizens remaining indoors as much as possible and venturing out only for necessary tasks. The markets operated on reduced schedules with little merchandise to sell. The churches remained full, crowded with people seeking solace and hope in prayer, when the material world offered neither. Constantine spent less time in the palace and more on the walls, living among his soldiers and sharing their dangers. His example inspired continued resistance, but it also meant he witnessed the gradual deterioration of his forces. He saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the trembling hands that came from too little food and sleep, the wounds that did not heal properly due to poor nutrition. He knew his army was running on determination and duty alone, that flesh and spirit had limits, and that those limits were approaching. On May 23rd, a strange atmospheric phenomenon occurred that terrified the population. A dense fog rolled in from the sea, so thick that visibility dropped to a few yards. This was unusual for the season and the conditions, and superstitious citizens interpreted it as an omen. When the fog lifted, some observers claimed the great dome of the Hagia Sophia had glowed with an unnatural reddish light, as though fire burned within it. This too was seen as a sign, though whether it portended divine protection or abandonment was debated. The priests tried to calm the population, but omens and portents were taken seriously in a world where the natural and supernatural interpenetrated, and these signs added to the pervasive anxiety. Mehmed, watching from his camp, saw the psychological vulnerability and decided the time was approaching for the final assault. His army was ready, his artillery had done its work, and the defenders were clearly at their breaking point. The Sultan began preparations for the ultimate storm, the concentrated assault that would commit his full strength against the weakened walls. He knew that such an attack would be costly, but he also knew it would succeed. The only question remaining was when to launch it, and that decision depended on ensuring every element was positioned for maximum effect. Constantinople had survived for 8 weeks. It would not survive much longer. The spiritual atmosphere within Constantinople grew heavier as May wore on, thick with dread and desperate piety. Churches that had maintained regular schedules of services now operated almost continuously, their doors open day and night for citizens seeking comfort in prayer. Priests heard confessions in endless succession, granting absolution to people who believed their deaths were imminent and wished to prepare their souls. The smell of incense hung perpetually in the air, mixing with smoke from candles burning before countless icons. The city was turning itself into one vast prayer, an appeal to heaven when earthly assistance had proven absent. The omens multiplied, and each was interpreted as divine communication about the city's fate. On May 22nd, a lunar eclipse darkened the moon to blood red, and ancient prophecies were recalled that spoke of Constantinople falling when the moon was in eclipse. The next day brought the strange fog and the alleged glow from the Hagia Sophia's dome, events that seemed to confirm supernatural attention to the city's crisis. Then on May 24th, during a religious procession carrying the Hodegetria icon, the most venerated image in the city, the icon slipped from its bearers and fell to the ground. When they tried to lift it again, the icon seemed impossibly heavy, as though refusing to move. The procession halted in confusion and growing panic until finally enough men were assembled to raise the icon and continue. The significance of these events was debated intensely. Some saw them as signs that God was withdrawing protection from the city, punishing Constantinople for its sins or for the schism with Rome that remained unhealed despite political union. Others interpreted them as tests of faith, trials that required steadfast belief rather than despair. The theologians and mystics offered competing explanations, but underneath all interpretations ran the common current of fear. The physical siege outside the walls had been accompanied by a spiritual siege within them, an erosion of confidence that divine favor would save the city as it had in centuries past. Yet even amid this atmosphere of doom, life continued with stubborn persistence. Families gathered in their homes, sharing what food remained and trying to maintain normalcy for children who understood that something terrible was happening but could not fully grasp the scope of the danger. Mothers sang lullabies to sons and daughters, the same songs that generations of Byzantine mothers had sung, providing continuity with the past, even as the future grew dark. Fathers wrote letters that they intended as final testaments, messages to be carried by survivors if the city fell, instructions for how property should be divided or how children should be raised. Among the nobility, similar preparations occurred, but with the added burden of political considerations. Aristocratic families possessed wealth in gold, jewels, and portable valuables that would need to be hidden or carried to safety. Some made arrangements with Genoese or Venetian ship captains to evacuate family members if escape became possible. These preparations were conducted quietly, since openly planning for defeat would undermine morale and could be construed as treason. Yet everyone with means was making similar calculations about how to preserve something from the approaching catastrophe. The soldiers on the walls came from all segments of society. There were professional Byzantine troops, the remnants of a military tradition that stretched back to the legions of Rome. There were Italian mercenaries who fought for gold, but also for honor and the camaraderie of shared danger. There were armed citizens, merchants, and craftsmen who had taken up weapons because the city lacked sufficient professional soldiers. There were priests and monks who manned sections of the walls, their faith making them willing to die in defense of Christendom. Each man had his own reasons for standing on those battered fortifications, and each faced his fear in his own way. One defender was a Genoese crossbowman named Paolo, who had come with Giustiniani's contingent and found himself assigned to the Mesotachion, the most dangerous section of the walls. Paolo was 23 years old, the son of a barrel maker from Genoa, who had signed on with Giustiniani seeking adventure and the wages that mercenary service could provide. He wrote letters to his mother that would never be sent, describing the siege in careful detail, trying to make her understand what he was experiencing. He wrote about the sound of the cannons, the way the walls shook with each impact, the exhaustion that made his hands tremble when he loaded his crossbow. He wrote about fear and duty and the strange brotherhood that formed among men who stood together under fire. Another was a Byzantine nobleman named Theodore, whose family had served the empire for centuries in various administrative and military capacities. Theodore was 42 years old, married with 3 children, and owned estates in Thrace that were now under Ottoman control. He commanded a section of the sea walls along the Golden Horn, a position less exposed than the land walls, but still requiring constant vigilance after the Ottoman fleet entered the harbour. Theodore had sent his wife and children to relatives in the Peloponnese before the siege began, a decision that brought him relief and guilt in equal measure. He stood on the walls defending a city that no longer contained his family, fighting for an empire that was more idea than reality, holding a position because duty and honor demanded it. Among the clergy was a monk named Gennadios, a fierce defender of Orthodox tradition who had opposed the union with Rome and preached against compromise with Catholic doctrine. Yet when the siege began, Gennadios took his place on the walls like any soldier, his theological purity coexisting with practical recognition that the city's survival transcended ecclesiastical disputes. He stood beside Catholic soldiers from Italy without comment, understanding that Ottoman conquest would end both Orthodox and Catholic presence in the city. His presence on the walls, praying while arrows flew past, represented the pragmatic unity that the siege forced on previously divided communities. The question of religious union continued to divide the population despite the desperate circumstances. Many Orthodox Christians refused to attend services in the Hagia Sophia after December 1452, when a ceremony had commemorated the formal union of the churches. These holdouts worshipped in smaller churches and monasteries, maintaining what they saw as theological purity even as the walls crumbled. Some declared openly that they would rather die free under Islam than live as heretics under Rome, a sentiment that baffled Western observers but reflected centuries of mutual resentment between Eastern and Western Christianity. Constantine found himself caught between these competing factions, needing unity for the defense while watching his people fracture over religious questions. He attended services in the Hagia Sophia, accepting the union publicly while understanding that much of his population rejected it privately. He tried to bridge the divide through personal example, worshipping with Catholics and Orthodox alike, emphasizing shared Christian identity over theological distinctions. Yet he could not force unity of belief, and the religious controversy continued to simmer even as the military situation deteriorated. The emperor's own faith was tested by the circumstances he faced. Constantine was a pious man who attended services regularly and took his religious obligations seriously. He believed in divine providence and prayed daily for his city's deliverance. Yet he also faced the practical reality that prayer alone would not stop Ottoman cannons or replenish food supplies. His faith and his pragmatism existed in tension, each informing his decisions in ways that sometimes seemed contradictory. He prayed for a miracle while planning for defeat, hoping for divine intervention while acknowledging human limits. In late May, several of Constantine's advisors urged him to flee the city while escape remained possible. A ship could carry him to the Peloponnese, where he could establish government in exile and continue resistance from Byzantine territory, still unconquered. The emperor would survive, the imperial office would continue, and the idea of empire could persist, even if the capital fell. These arguments were logical and practical, and they came from people who genuinely cared for Constantine's safety and the empire's future. Constantine rejected these appeals without hesitation. He was the emperor of the Romans, and the emperor's place was in Constantinople. To flee while his people fought and died would make him unworthy of the title he bore and the crown he wore. If the city fell, he would die with it, and his death would testify that the empire had been defended to the last by its rightful ruler. This decision was not suicidal impulse, but reasoned commitment to duty as he understood it. The office of emperor carried obligations that transcended personal survival, and one of those obligations was to stand with the city in its darkest hour. His resolve affected those around him profoundly. If the emperor would not abandon Constantinople, how could anyone else justify flight? The soldiers took strength from his example, understanding that they fought alongside their ruler rather than serving some distant figure who had removed himself to safety. The civilians saw their emperor walking the walls, attending services with them, sharing the privations of siege life, and they found in his presence a reason to endure a while longer. Yet Constantine was not naive about the situation. He understood the mathematics that made defeat virtually certain. He knew that walls could not stand forever against such bombardment, that exhausted soldiers could not repel unlimited assaults, that food would run out before Ottoman determination did. He was fighting for time in the hope that something would change, that relief would arrive, or that Mehmed would lose patience and withdraw. But as each day passed without such developments, the probable outcome grew ever clearer. The city itself bore the marks of 2 months under siege. Buildings near the walls showed damage from artillery fire, their roofs collapsed or walls breached. Fires had consumed entire blocks where incendiary projectiles had started blazes that spread before they could be controlled. The streets were quieter than normal, with fewer vendors and less commerce. Those who did venture out moved quickly, heads down, trying not to dwell on the Ottoman army visible beyond the walls or the sound of bombardment that had become the city's constant soundtrack. The population had shrunk as the siege progressed. Some had fled in the early days before the encirclement was complete, sailing to Venetian or Genoese territories while escape remained possible. Others had died from disease, accidents, or the bombardment itself. The total number remaining was perhaps 40,000 souls, down from the 50,000 at the siege's start. These survivors crowded into the safer areas away from the walls, creating temporary communities of refugees within their own city. Children's play reflected the siege in disturbing ways. They built miniature walls from stones and defended them against imaginary Turks. They played at being Janissaries or Byzantine soldiers, acting out scenarios of assault and defense with the casual violence of the young who do not fully comprehend death. Their games disturbed adults who saw in them a preview of trauma that would mark a generation, assuming any of these children survived to become adults. The merchants who remained open dealt primarily in necessities, and their prices reflected scarcity. A loaf of bread cost more than a day's wages for a common laborer. Wine was cheaper than bread, since the city's cellars held ample supplies of wine while grain stores dwindled. Some drank to forget the siege, to dull fear and hunger with alcohol that provided empty calories and temporary oblivion. Others refused such escape, maintaining sobriety in the belief that they might need their wits if the walls fell and survival required quick thinking. Physicians worked among the wounded, treating casualties from the bombardment and the assaults. Their supplies of medicines and bandages were running low, and they improvised with whatever materials they could find. Men with severe wounds often died from infection rather than the injuries themselves, since the unsanitary conditions of siege life meant that even minor wounds could fester. The physicians did what they could, but they were fighting against odds as unfavorable as those facing the soldiers on the walls. Throughout all of this, the sense persisted that Constantinople represented something more than just another city facing conquest. This was the last fragment of the Roman Empire, the final living connection to the classical world. For 11 centuries, Constantinople had preserved Greek learning, Roman law, and Christian theology, while Western Europe struggled through the chaos of the Dark Ages. The libraries within the city held manuscripts that existed nowhere else, the accumulated wisdom of antiquity copied and preserved by generations of Byzantine scribes. If Constantinople fell, this knowledge was at risk. Some of it would survive through copies in Western libraries, but much would be lost or destroyed. The defenders understood that they were protecting more than walls and lives. They were defending a civilization, a 1,000-year tradition of culture and learning that had shaped the world. When they stood on those battered fortifications, they stood for Rome itself, for the idea that law and order and culture could prevail against barbarism. That this defense was failing made it no less meaningful. They would fight to the end, and their deaths would testify that civilization had been valued enough to die for. In the cosmic accounting, they believed, such testimony mattered more than victory or defeat. The defenders of Constantinople were writing the final chapter of their empire's story, and they intended it to be worthy of the 1,100 years that had preceded it. By May 26, Mehmed had made his decision. The walls were sufficiently damaged, his troops were positioned and prepared, and further delay served no purpose. The defenders were exhausted and depleted, their food supplies critically low, and morale had been ground down by weeks of relentless pressure. The moment had arrived for the final assault, the concentrated attack that would commit the full strength of the Ottoman army against Constantinople's crumbling defences. The Sultan gathered his commanders and announced that the assault would begin in the early hours of May 29th, allowing time for final preparations and troop positioning. The Ottoman camp transformed into a hive of purposeful activity. Troops received orders for their specific roles in the attack, with the assault planned in waves that would exhaust the defenders through sheer volume and persistence. The irregular troops, the Bashi Bazouks, would go first, expendable forces whose casualties would matter little but who would tire the defenders and deplete their ammunition. After them would come the Anatolian provincial troops, better disciplined and equipped than the irregulars, but still not the elite force. Only after these waves had worn down the defense would the Janissaries advance, the Sultan's finest soldiers, who would deliver the decisive blow through whatever breaches had been created or held most promise. Mehmed addressed his army on May 27th, riding along the lines where thousands of troops had assembled to hear their commander. His words were translated and relayed throughout the camp so that soldiers who could not hear him directly would receive his message. He spoke of the glory that awaited those who took Constantinople, invoking religious prophecies that praised the conqueror of this city. He promised 3 days of unrestricted plunder to his troops, a traditional incentive in siege warfare that meant every soldier could enrich himself from the wealth accumulated over centuries in the greatest city of the eastern Mediterranean. Gold, jewels, silks, slaves, and goods beyond measure would belong to those who breached the walls. The promise ignited fevered anticipation among troops who understood that taking Constantinople meant instant wealth. The religious element was emphasized heavily. Mehmed's clerics preached that capturing this Christian stronghold was a holy duty, that martyrs who died in the assault would enter paradise immediately, and that God favored the righteous cause of Islam over the corrupt Christianity of the Byzantines. These sermons had been delivered throughout the siege, but now they intensified, preparing soldiers psychologically for the bloodshed ahead. The Ottoman camp rang with prayers and religious chants as troops sought divine blessing for the coming battle. On May 27th, Mehmed sent one final embassy to Constantine with terms for peaceful surrender. The offer was similar to previous proposals, but delivered with greater urgency. Surrender the city immediately, and the population could depart safely with their portable possessions. Constantine could retain rule over the Peloponnese as an Ottoman tributary. Alternatively, the emperor could pay an enormous annual tribute and remain in Constantinople as a vassal of the Sultan. The choice was between these terms or the consequences of the city falling by assault, which would bring no mercy. Constantine received the envoys in the palace with his advisers present. The terms were discussed briefly, though everyone understood the answer before words were spoken. The emperor thanked the envoys for their message and conveyed his response with quiet dignity. He could not surrender Constantinople, the city entrusted to his care and defense. He would pay no tribute that acknowledged Ottoman supremacy over the remnant of Rome. If God willed that the city should fall, then it would fall, but it would not be surrendered. The emperor prayed that the Sultan would withdraw his forces and avoid the bloodshed that assault would bring, though he harbored no illusion that such withdrawal would occur. The envoys departed to relay this refusal, and Mehmed expressed no surprise at the answer he received. That same day the Sultan assembled his forces in a grand review that was partly practical inspection and partly psychological demonstration. Regiment after regiment marched past his reviewing position, their numbers seeming endless, their weapons glittering in the sunlight, their banners creating a forest of coloured silk. The defenders watching from the walls could see this display and understand its meaning. They would face this multitude in battle within hours, and the disparity in numbers was crushing. The review continued through the afternoon, a parade of military might meant to break Byzantine spirits before the assault even began. Inside Constantinople, Constantine prepared his own forces and his own soul for what was coming. He knew the assault was imminent, recognizing the signs from the intensified Ottoman activity and the timing of Mehmed's final offer. The evening of May 28th would be the last night before the storm, the final hours in which his soldiers might rest and prepare themselves for battle. The emperor ordered that all commanders should gather at the palace for a final council, a meeting that would serve as strategy session and farewell in equal measure. As darkness fell on May 28th, the commanders assembled in a hall lit by candles and oil lamps. Their faces showed the strain of 8 weeks under siege, the exhaustion and hunger and accumulated stress of defending against impossible odds. Giustiniani was there, his Genoese mercenaries having borne the heaviest fighting at the Mesotachion. The Venetian captains attended, representing the sailors and marines who had fought on the sea walls. Byzantine nobles who commanded various sectors reported their readiness and their concerns. The Catalan and Spanish soldiers sent representatives, as did the handful of other nationalities who had chosen to stand with Constantinople in its final trial. Constantine spoke to them without false optimism or theatrical drama. He acknowledged the situation plainly. The walls were badly damaged, the defenders were exhausted and outnumbered, food and ammunition were critically low, and no relief was coming. The assault tomorrow would be massive and determined, waves of troops attacking until the defences broke or the Ottomans exhausted themselves in the attempt. Every man in the room understood that the most likely outcome was defeat, that they were probably living their final hours. The emperor thanked them for their service, for their courage, and for standing with Constantinople when so many others had abandoned it. He spoke of duty and honor, of defending civilization against the tide of conquest, of bearing witness through their resistance that some things mattered more than survival. He acknowledged the religious divisions that had plagued the defense, but urged that these disputes be forgotten in the final battle. Christian stood with Christian now, Orthodox and Catholic, together, and their shared faith in God mattered more than theological technicalities. He asked them to forgive him for any failures in his leadership, for decisions that had perhaps been wrong, for the defeat that seemed unavoidable despite everyone's best efforts. Then Constantine made a more personal plea. He asked them to fight with all their strength tomorrow, to make the Ottomans pay dearly for every yard of ground, to ensure that the fall of Constantinople would be remembered as a battle of such ferocity that future generations would speak of it with awe. If they were to die, let them die as warriors defending their city rather than as victims submitting to conquest. Let the last Romans write a final chapter worthy of all the centuries that had preceded this moment. Let their deaths testify that Rome had fought to the end. The speech was neither long nor particularly eloquent by the standards of classical oratory, but its sincerity and directness moved the assembled commanders profoundly. Several wept openly, not from fear, but from the terrible sadness of witnessing an empire's end. Others sat in silence, absorbing the emperor's words and preparing themselves mentally for what dawn would bring. When Constantine finished speaking, he embraced each commander individually, thanking them personally and offering words of encouragement. These private moments, witnessed by the others in the flickering candlelight, created a final bond of shared purpose among men who knew they would likely not survive another day. After the commanders departed to their positions, Constantine attended a religious service in the Hagia Sophia. The great cathedral was crowded with civilians and soldiers, Orthodox and Catholic, worshipping together in acknowledgement that this might be the last Christian service ever celebrated in this church. The theological disputes that had divided them throughout the siege were set aside for this final liturgy. The Patriarch led the Orthodox rites, while Catholic priests celebrated in their own tradition, and the congregation participated in both without controversy. The air was thick with incense and prayer, the ancient hymns rising to the massive dome that had sheltered Christian worship for 900 years. Constantine knelt before the altar in full view of his people, praying for his city and his soul with humble intensity. He received communion from both Orthodox and Catholic clergy, a public demonstration of unity that silenced any remaining objections to his acceptance of religious union. When the service concluded, he stood and addressed the congregation briefly, asking for their prayers and their forgiveness. Many in the crowd pushed forward to touch him, to receive a final blessing from their emperor, to express loyalty and love for the ruler who had chosen to die with them rather than flee to safety. Leaving the Hagia Sophia, Constantine returned to the palace only long enough to remove his imperial regalia. He exchanged the jeweled crown and elaborate robes for the armor of a common soldier, keeping only a purple cloak that marked him as emperor. This transformation was deliberate and symbolic. Tomorrow he would fight not as a ceremonial figure, but as a warrior among warriors, standing in the line with his soldiers rather than directing from safety. The office of emperor carried obligations beyond survival, and one of those obligations was to die with dignity if death could not be avoided. The emperor then rode through the darkened streets of Constantinople on a final inspection of the defenses. He stopped at various positions along the walls, speaking briefly with the soldiers stationed there, offering encouragement and hearing their concerns. He visited the Mesotachion, where Justiniani commanded, examining the damaged fortifications and discussing plans for meeting the assault. He rode along the Golden Horn walls and the Sea of Marmara defenses, ensuring that these sectors remained adequately manned despite the concentration of forces at the land walls. Everywhere he appeared, soldiers drew strength from his presence, understanding that their emperor stood with them in the final trial. The night was relatively quiet, with the bombardment suspended as Ottoman troops took their positions for the assault. This silence was more unnerving than the constant artillery fire had been, a pregnant pause that spoke of gathering violence. The defenders used the reprieve to make final preparations, checking weapons and armor, repairing a few last sections of wall, stockpiling projectiles and Greek fire, and mentally preparing for battle. Some wrote final letters to families or loved ones, messages that might be carried by survivors or recovered from bodies. Others prayed, seeking courage and peace in whatever faith they followed. In the small hours before dawn on May 29th, Constantine returned to his command position at the Mesotachion. He had said his farewells, made his preparations, and attended to both spiritual and practical duties. Now there was nothing to do but wait for the assault he knew was coming. He stood on the battered walls, looking out toward the Ottoman camp, where thousands of fires illuminated a landscape transformed by war. He could see the dark masses of troops assembling in their attack formations, hear the distant sound of drums and prayers, sense the immense violence preparing to unleash itself against his city. Beside him stood Justiniani and other commanders who had gathered at this most threatened position. They spoke little, each man alone with his thoughts, despite the company surrounding him. The sky began to lighten in the east, not yet dawn, but the first hint that night was ending. The silence felt absolute despite the background noises of two armies preparing for combat. In that pregnant pause before violence erupted, Constantine said a final prayer for his city, his people, and his own soul. Then the Ottoman drums began to beat with a rhythm that signaled the assault's beginning, and the last battle for Constantinople commenced as the sun prepared to rise on the final day of the Byzantine Empire. The assault began in darkness at approximately 1:30 in the morning on May 29, 1453. The Ottoman drums thundered suddenly across the night, a rolling crescendo that signaled the beginning of the attack. Within moments, the sound was joined by war cries from thousands of throats, cymbals clashing, trumpets blaring, and the noise of an army surging forward in the darkness. The defenders scrambled to their positions, bells ringing throughout Constantinople to summon every able man to the walls. The exhausted soldiers who had been attempting to rest jerked awake and ran toward their assigned sectors, fastening armor as they moved, gripping weapons with hands that trembled from fatigue and fear. The first wave consisted of the Bashi bazouks, irregular troops who served without pay but expected rich plunder if the city fell. These men were considered expendable by Ottoman commanders, sent forward to absorb the initial defensive fire and exhaust the defenders before more valuable troops committed. They came on in a screaming mass, carrying ladders and grappling hooks, their individual courage driven by religious fervor and greed in equal measure. The darkness worked to their advantage initially, making it difficult for defenders to target them precisely, allowing them to cross the ground between the Ottoman lines and the walls before the Byzantines could respond with organized volleys. Yet as the irregulars reached the moat and began attempting to scale the ruined outer wall, the defenders found their range. Arrows and crossbow bolts rained down from the battlements, each shaft finding targets in the packed masses below. Stones dropped from the walls, crushed skulls and broke bones. Greek fire sprayed from siphons, turning the darkness into hellish illumination as burning men ran screaming in all directions, their flesh melting from their bodies. The slaughter was horrific, with Ottoman casualties mounting rapidly as wave after wave of irregulars threw themselves against defenses that remained stubbornly intact despite 2 months of bombardment. The fighting was most intense at the Mesotikon, where Giustiniani commanded and where the walls had sustained the heaviest damage. Here, the outer wall had collapsed completely, and the second wall showed massive breaches that were defended only by improvised barriers of timber and earth. The irregulars focused their assault on this sector, correctly identifying it as the weakest point, and the defenders responded with desperate ferocity. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in the rubble between the shattered walls, with Ottoman troops attempting to establish footholds and Byzantine soldiers driving them back with swords and spears and sheer determination not to yield ground. Giustiniani was everywhere in this chaos, his voice cutting through the din of battle as he directed his troops and led by example. He fought in the front line when necessary, his sword bloody within minutes of the assault's beginning. His Italian mercenaries responded to his leadership with disciplined courage, holding their positions when lesser troops might have broken, maintaining organized resistance when chaos threatened to dissolve the defense. The Genoese commander had trained for exactly this situation, and his professional competence showed as he anticipated Ottoman tactics and deployed his limited forces to maximum effect. For 2 hours the irregulars battered themselves against the walls with mounting casualties and no significant gains. The defenders held every critical point, repelling the assaults and inflicting losses that would have broken most armies. Yet Mehmed had anticipated heavy casualties in this opening wave, and he fed fresh irregulars into the battle as earlier waves faltered. The point was not to break through immediately, but to exhaust the defenders, to force them to expend ammunition and energy to wear them down for the waves that would follow. As dawn began to break around 3:30 in the morning, Mehmed ordered the second wave forward. These were the Anatolian provincial troops, the Sipahis and their retainers, who formed the backbone of Ottoman provincial military power. Better armed and more disciplined than the irregulars, these soldiers advanced with grim purpose rather than wild enthusiasm. They carried better equipment, including firearms, and they moved with tactical awareness rather than simple forward momentum. The scale of the assault increased dramatically as these fresh troops joined the irregulars, who still fought in the ruins of the outer fortifications. The defenders found themselves hard-pressed as the quality of attackers improved. The Anatolian troops brought ladders that were longer and sturdier than those the irregulars had used, and they erected them against the walls with covering fire from arquebusiers whose bullets struck defenders on the battlements. Several sections of walls saw Ottoman soldiers reaching the top of ladders and attempting to gain footholds on the battlements, leading to savage fighting at close quarters. The Byzantines threw down the ladders when possible, sending attackers falling to their deaths, but more ladders rose immediately to replace those destroyed. Constantine moved along the walls, encouraging his troops and fighting alongside them when the press became too great. His purple cloak made him visible, and Ottoman soldiers who recognized the imperial color tried specifically to reach him, understanding that killing the emperor would shatter Byzantine resistance. Yet Constantine survived these attempts through a combination of skill, luck, and the protection of soldiers who threw themselves into danger to shield their ruler. He was no longer directing the defense from a command position, but participating in it as a warrior, his sword taking Ottoman lives and his presence inspiring continued resistance. The Mesotachion remained the critical sector, and here the fighting reached levels of intensity that exceeded anything seen earlier in the siege. The Anatolian troops pushed through the rubble of the outer wall and attacked the improvised barriers defending the breaches in the second wall. They came in organized formations rather than uncoordinated rushes, and their persistence began to tell. Several times Ottoman soldiers gained temporary footholds on the inner wall, only to be driven back by counterattacks led by Giustiniani personally. The defenders were holding but barely, their numbers depleted by casualties and exhaustion, their ammunition running dangerously low. Around 5 in the morning, after 3.5 hours of continuous combat, Mehmed committed his elite force. The Janissaries had been held in reserve throughout the earlier waves, their discipline allowing them to stand ready while irregulars and provincial troops wore down the defense. Now these 12,000 professional soldiers advanced in perfect order, their white caps distinctive in the growing light, their weapons gleaming, their confidence absolute. They marched to the sound of drums and the chanting of prayers, a military brotherhood advancing to accomplish what their predecessors had failed to achieve. The psychological impact of seeing the Janissaries advance was crushing for the defenders. These were not expendable irregulars or provincial levies, but the finest infantry in the world, fresh and ready for battle, while the Byzantines had been fighting for hours. The defenders watched them come with despair, mixed with determination, knowing this was the decisive moment. If the Janissaries broke through, the city would fall. If they could be held, Ottoman morale might crack, and Mehmed might withdraw. Everything depended on the next hour of fighting. The Janissaries struck the Mesotachion like a hammer blow, their assault coordinated and relentless. They advanced under covering fire from their own arquebusiers, laid their ladders against the walls, and climbed with disciplined speed. The defenders met them with everything remaining, firing until arrows and crossbow bolts were exhausted, hurling stones and beams and anything that might dislodge attackers, spraying Greek fire in great gouts of flame. The slaughter was mutual and terrible, with casualties mounting on both sides as the battle reached its climax. In the midst of this desperate fighting, disaster struck the defense. Giustiniani, fighting in the front ranks at the Mesotachion, was hit by a projectile that pierced his breastplate and wounded him severely in the chest. The injury was not immediately fatal, but was serious enough to incapacitate him, and his subordinates carried him from the walls to seek medical treatment. His departure at this critical moment had consequences beyond the loss of his personal combat effectiveness. The sight of their commander being carried wounded from the field shook the morale of his Italian mercenaries, and confusion spread about who now commanded the sector. Worse, one of the gates through the inner wall was opened to allow Giustiniani to be carried to the rear for treatment, and this opening created momentary vulnerability that alert Ottoman officers noticed. Janissaries rushed toward the briefly opened gate, and though it was closed again quickly, the incident had disrupted the defense and created an opportunity for exploitation. The Italian mercenaries, uncertain about command and worried about their wounded leader, began to waver. Some pulled back from their positions, seeking to regroup or perhaps simply to escape the slaughter. This localized retreat created gaps in the defensive line that the Janissaries immediately sought to exploit. At almost the same moment, approximately a mile to the north at the Blashanet Palace section of the walls, an accident of catastrophic consequence occurred. A small gate called the Kerkerporta, used for sorties during the siege, had been left unlocked through oversight or confusion. This postern gate was located in a section of wall between the Blashanet Palace and the main Theodosian fortifications, and it had been opened the previous night to allow a sortie party to return to the city. In the chaos of the final assault and the exhaustion of the defenders, no one had secured the gate afterward. A group of Ottoman soldiers exploring the base of the walls for any weakness discovered the unlocked gate. They pushed it open cautiously, expecting a trap, but found it genuinely undefended. Approximately 50 Janissaries poured through the Kerkerporta before defenders realized what was happening. These troops found themselves inside the walls, between the fortifications and the city, in a position to attack the defenders from behind. They raised Ottoman banners on the walls above the gate, visible to both armies, signaling that the city's defenses had been breached. The sight of Ottoman banners flying from the walls sent shockwaves through both forces. Byzantine defenders who saw the flags feared that major breaches had occurred elsewhere, that the walls had failed comprehensively, and that continued resistance was futile. Ottoman troops took courage from what appeared to be evidence of imminent victory, pressing their assaults with renewed energy. The defenders at the Kerkerporta fought desperately to contain the breach, killing many of the Janissaries who had entered, but more Ottoman troops were pouring through the gate with every passing minute. At the Mesotakion, the wavering defense following Giustiniani's wounding now began to collapse. The combination of their commander's injury, the exhaustion of hours of combat, the sight of Ottoman banners on the walls to the north, and the relentless Janissary assault proved too much. Sections of the defensive line broke as soldiers fled toward the interior of the city. The Janissaries surged through the gaps, climbing over the improvised barriers and establishing positions on the inner wall itself. What had been a coordinated defense fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance and general retreat. Constantine, fighting nearby, saw the collapse beginning and understood what it meant. The walls had held for 8 weeks but were finally failing. The breach was imminent, and the city would fall within hours or perhaps minutes. In this moment of ultimate crisis, the emperor made his final decision. He would not retreat, would not flee to fight another day, would not attempt escape to the Peloponnese or any other refuge. He would die here, now, fighting in the breach as the walls fell, dying as a warrior rather than surviving as the emperor who lost Constantinople. The emperor removed his imperial regalia, tearing off the purple cloak that marked him as ruler, casting aside any symbol that distinguished him from the common soldiers fighting beside him. Some sources later claimed he announced his identity before charging toward the breach, proclaiming that the city was falling and that he would die as Constantine, last of the Romans. Other accounts suggested he went forward in silence, just another soldier in the chaos of combat. The exact details were lost in the confusion and violence of those final moments, witnessed by men who would themselves soon die or who survived with memories fragmented by trauma and fear. What is certain is that Constantine V Palaiologos charged toward the breach at the Mesotakion, sword in hand, hurling himself into the mass of Ottoman troops who had gained the walls. He disappeared into the press of combat, swallowed by the chaos of battle, and was never seen alive again. The last emperor of Rome died fighting in defense of his capital, fulfilling the oath he had made to stand with his city in its final trial. His body was never definitively identified, lost among the thousands of dead who littered the walls and streets when the fighting ended. He became legend in that moment, the emperor who refused to survive his empire, who died with sword in hand rather than accept defeat with breath in his body. With Constantine's death and the breach at the Kirkaporta widening, the organized defense of Constantinople collapsed completely. The Janissaries poured through multiple breaches, overwhelming the remaining pockets of resistance. The defenders who could escape fled toward the Golden Horn, hoping to find ships, though most were cut down in the streets or captured. Those who stood and fought died where they stood, brief acts of defiance against the inevitable. The walls that had stood for 11 centuries had finally fallen, not through any weakness in the engineering, but through overwhelming force applied with relentless determination against exhausted defenders who had fought beyond all reasonable limits of human endurance. The battle for Constantinople was over, and the city's fall had begun. The Ottoman soldiers flooding through the breaches encountered little organized resistance once the walls were lost. Small groups of defenders made stands at churches, in houses, and at street corners, fighting until they were overwhelmed and killed. These final acts of defiance were brave but futile, brief interruptions in the tide of conquest that swept through Constantinople's streets. The Janissaries moved through the city in organized units, securing key positions and strategic buildings, while the less disciplined troops behind them began the work of plunder that Mehmed had promised. The sun rose fully on May 29th to illuminate a city in chaos and transformation. Ottoman banners appeared on towers and prominent buildings throughout Constantinople, each one signaling the extent of the conquest. The great walls that had protected the city for a millennium now sheltered Ottoman soldiers who occupied the battlements and controlled the gates. The sounds of combat faded gradually through the morning as the last pockets of resistance were eliminated or surrendered. In their place came different sounds, the cries of civilians being rounded up, the crash of doors being broken down, the screams of those who chose or were forced to die rather than submit. Mehmed had promised his troops 3 days of unrestricted plunder, a traditional reward in siege warfare and an incentive that had helped motivate the assault. Now that promise was kept, and Ottoman soldiers scattered through the city seeking wealth and captives. Houses were broken into and stripped of valuables, with soldiers competing to find the richest residences and the most valuable goods. Gold, silver, jewels, silks, and fine furniture were carried off by men who had been common soldiers in the morning and became wealthy in the afternoon. Churches were particular targets since they contained centuries of accumulated treasures, golden vessels for communion, jeweled icons, embroidered vestments, and precious metals worked into religious art. The population of Constantinople faced a range of fates depending on age, gender, location, and luck. Many were killed in the initial conquest, either fighting or attempting to flee, or simply being in the wrong place when soldiers sought to eliminate any potential resistance. Others were captured and enslaved, the victors claiming human property as part of their share of plunder. Under Islamic law as practiced by the Ottomans, those who resisted to the end could be enslaved, and the resistance Constantinople had offered meant that much of the population was considered legitimate spoils. Young men and women were particularly valuable as slaves, and soldiers sought them out with predatory focus. Families were torn apart, children separated from parents, husbands from wives, as individuals were claimed by different soldiers or sold to slave dealers who appeared within hours of the city's fall. The pretty and the young fetched the highest prices, destined for households throughout the Ottoman Empire, or for export to slave markets elsewhere in the Mediterranean. The old and infirm had little value and were often killed or left to their fates, abandoned in a city that no longer had any system to care for them. Some citizens had hidden in churches, believing that sacred spaces would offer sanctuary, or that divine intervention might yet save them. The largest such gathering occurred at the Hagia Sophia, where thousands of refugees crowded into the great cathedral seeking protection. They prayed desperately as the sounds of conquest echoed outside the massive bronze doors, hoping that the sanctity of the place would shield them, or that the end of days prophesied in apocalyptic texts was at hand, and that Christ would return to save his faithful. When Ottoman soldiers reached the Hagia Sophia in mid-morning, they found the doors barred from inside. The sound of axes striking bronze echoed through the church as the soldiers worked to break through, each blow audible to the thousands huddled inside. When the doors finally gave way and troops poured into the cathedral, they found a population paralyzed by fear and religious fervor. The soldiers began selecting captives, taking the young and valuable while killing those who resisted or who had no economic value. The floor of the great church, which had echoed with Christian liturgy for 9 centuries, ran with blood as conquest came to the most sacred space in the Byzantine world. Mehmed himself entered Constantinople around midday, riding through the streets at the head of his bodyguard. He proceeded directly to the Hagia Sophia, the symbolic heart of Byzantine Christianity, and the prize that made the entire siege worthwhile. The Sultan dismounted at the entrance and paused to sprinkle dirt on his turban, a gesture of humility before God at the moment of triumph. Then he entered the cathedral, walking across the marble floors where emperors had been crowned, and where the patriarch had led worship for centuries beyond counting. The interior of the Hagia Sophia overwhelmed even the conquering Sultan. The vast space, the soaring dome that seemed to float impossibly above the floor, the golden mosaics that gleamed in the light streaming through high windows, all testified to a civilization of profound artistic and architectural achievement. Mehmed stood in silence, absorbing the majesty of the building and understanding that he now possessed something beyond mere military victory. He had captured the greatest church in Christendom, and he would transform it into a symbol of Islamic triumph. The Sultan ordered that the cathedral be converted immediately into a mosque. A wooden minaret was constructed outside to call the faithful to prayer, though permanent minarets would be added later. The Christian iconography posed a theological problem since Islamic tradition prohibited figurative religious images. Mehmed ordered that the mosaics depicting Christ, Mary, and the saints be covered with plaster rather than destroyed, a pragmatic decision that preserved the art even while hiding it from view. The altar was dismantled, and a mihrab indicating the direction of Mecca was installed in its place. By Friday, June the 1st, less than 4 days after the city's fall, the first Muslim prayers were conducted in what was now the Hagia Sophia Mosque. The transformation of the Hagia Sophia represented more than religious conquest. It symbolized the definitive end of the Byzantine Empire and the establishment of Ottoman supremacy over what had been the Eastern Christian world's spiritual center. For Orthodox Christians throughout the Balkans and beyond, the news that the great cathedral had become a mosque carried devastating psychological impact. The physical structure survived, but its meaning had been inverted, transformed from the house of God they recognized into a space dedicated to what they considered false religion. The 3 days of plunder produced scenes of destruction and appropriation that scarred the city permanently. Libraries that had preserved classical manuscripts for centuries were ransacked, with soldiers who could not read tearing pages from books to use as packing material or fuel for fires. Some manuscripts were saved by soldiers who recognized their potential value and preserved them for sale to collectors. Others were destroyed through ignorance or malice, reducing to ashes works that existed nowhere else in the world. The loss of knowledge was impossible to quantify, but it was certainly substantial, centuries of accumulated learning scattered or destroyed in a matter of days. Churches throughout the city met various fates. Some were converted to mosques immediately, following the pattern established at the Hagia Sophia. Others were stripped of their treasures but left standing, their congregations dispersed, and their future uncertain. A few were demolished entirely, their stones repurposed for Ottoman construction projects. The physical transformation of Constantinople from Christian to Muslim city began immediately and would continue for decades, but the essential change occurred in those first 3 days, when the symbols and structures of Byzantine Christianity were systematically appropriated or eliminated. The death toll from the siege and the final assault was substantial but difficult to determine with precision. Byzantine casualties during the siege itself probably numbered in the hundreds, with the defensive garrison of around 7,000 reduced by combat deaths, disease, and desertion. The final assault killed thousands more, both soldiers fighting on the walls and civilians caught in the chaos. Ottoman casualties were far higher in absolute numbers due to their repeated assaults, though they represented a smaller percentage of the much larger attacking force. Estimates suggest that 4,000 or more Ottoman soldiers died in the final assault alone, with many times that number wounded. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, who had led the defense of the Mesotachion, survived his wound long enough to be evacuated to a ship in the Golden Horn. He was carried to the island of Chios, where he died of his injuries several days after the city's fall. His death removed one of the few authoritative witnesses who might have provided detailed accounts of the battle's critical moments. His soldiers, those who survived, scattered across the Mediterranean, carrying with them memories of the siege and its tragic conclusion. Some defenders managed to escape during or immediately after the walls fell. Venetian and Genoese ships in the Golden Horn attempted to take on refugees, though many were overloaded and some sank or were captured by Ottoman vessels. Those who successfully escaped carried the news of Constantinople's fall to the west, arriving in Italian ports with reports that shocked European courts. These survivors also brought with them whatever possessions they could carry, including in some cases precious manuscripts and religious items salvaged from the destruction. Among the refugees were Greek scholars who had been present in Constantinople during the siege. These men carried with them knowledge of classical Greek language and literature, expertise that had been preserved in the Byzantine world but was rare in Western Europe. Their arrival in Italy contributed to the intellectual movement already underway, the Renaissance that would transform European culture. Manuscripts they brought, or that were purchased from dealers in the conquest's aftermath, introduced Western scholars to Greek texts in their original language, providing access to Plato, Aristotle, and other classical authors that had been known only through Latin translations or not at all. The fate of Constantine XI's body remained a mystery that generated legends and speculation for centuries. The emperor had died fighting at the breach, but in the chaos and slaughter of those moments, no one could identify his corpse with certainty. Mehmed reportedly offered a reward for the emperor's body, wishing to display it as proof of victory. Several bodies were presented as possibly being Constantine, but none could be confirmed. The most persistent story claimed that the emperor's head was cut off and displayed on a column in Constantinople before being sent to other cities as proof of Ottoman victory, but this account lacks reliable verification. The uncertainty about Constantine's final resting place added to his legendary status. Some believed he had not truly died, but had been turned to marble by an angel and hidden away, destined to awaken when Constantinople returned to Christian rule. This legend of the marble emperor persisted for centuries among Greeks under Ottoman rule, a mythic promise that the last emperor would return and restore the Byzantine Empire. The story served psychological and political purposes, maintaining hope among a conquered people and providing a narrative of eventual redemption. Mehmed ordered that the city be repopulated and rebuilt, understanding that Constantinople's value lay not just in its conquest but in its continued function as an urban centre. He declared the city his new capital, relocating the Ottoman court from Adrianople to Constantinople, which would be known henceforth as Istanbul to its Turkish inhabitants, though Constantinople remained common in Western usage. The Sultan encouraged immigration by offering tax incentives and property to those who would settle in the city, drawing population from throughout his empire. Greeks, Armenians, Jews and Turks would all have quarters in the new Istanbul, creating a cosmopolitan city that would remain the Ottoman capital for nearly 5 centuries. The physical scars of siege and conquest healed gradually as buildings were repaired and new construction began. The population, which had fallen to perhaps 40,000 at the siege's end, and then been reduced further by death and enslavement, slowly recovered as immigrants arrived. Within a generation, Istanbul would rival and then exceed the population Constantinople had held in its medieval prime. The city's strategic location and harbour ensured continued importance, and Ottoman investment in infrastructure and architecture would create a new golden age, even as the memory of Byzantine glory faded into history. For the survivors who had defended Constantinople, whether they remained in the conquered city or fled to other lands, the fall represented personal and collective catastrophe. They had witnessed the end of an empire, the destruction of a civilization, the transformation of their world into something unrecognizable. Yet they had also participated in one of history's great sieges, defending their city with courage that won respect even from enemies. The memory of that defense, of Constantine's final charge, of the walls that had stood for 8 weeks against impossible odds, would be preserved in the stories they told and passed down through generations. Constantinople had fallen, but the tale of its fall would endure. The fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, sent shockwaves across Europe and the Mediterranean world that continued reverberating for decades. News travelled slowly by the standards of later centuries, carried by ships and riders, spreading from port to port and court to court through the summer and fall of that year. When the reports reached Rome, Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade to recapture the city, though his appeals generated sympathy, but little military commitment from European princes still exhausted from their own conflicts. In Venice and Genoa, the commercial republics mourned the loss of a trading partner and worried about Ottoman control of the straits that connected their markets to the Black Sea. Throughout Orthodox Christian communities in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, the fall was experienced as both political disaster and spiritual catastrophe, the loss of their faith's greatest city to Islamic conquest. Mehmed II emerged from the siege with the title he had sought, known thereafter as Mehmed the Conqueror, Fatih Sultan Mehmed in Turkish. At age 21, he had accomplished what generations of Islamic rulers had attempted and failed to achieve since the 7th century. His reputation soared not only in the Ottoman Empire but throughout the Islamic world, where he was celebrated as the fulfillment of prophecies attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, praising the conqueror of Constantinople. This prestige gave him authority and legitimacy that transcended mere military success, positioning him as a leader of exceptional divine favor and strategic brilliance. The young sultan devoted enormous energy to rebuilding and repopulating his new capital. He understood that conquest alone was insufficient without consolidation, that the city's value lay in its continued function as a vibrant urban center rather than as ruins occupied by a garrison. Mehmed issued decrees encouraging immigration, offering tax exemptions and property grants to those who would settle in Istanbul. He relocated forcibly some populations from other parts of his empire, transplanting entire communities to help restore the city's vitality. Greeks were encouraged to remain or return, and Mehmed appointed a new patriarch to lead the Orthodox Church, recognizing that the Christian population needed religious leadership if they were to remain productive subjects. The physical reconstruction of Istanbul proceeded with impressive speed and scope. Damaged sections of the Theodosian Walls were repaired, since they remained strategically valuable as fortifications. The Hagia Sophia received maintenance and modification to serve its new function as a mosque, with structural reinforcements added to support the building through future earthquakes. New mosques, palaces, and public buildings were commissioned, creating an architectural landscape that blended Byzantine foundations with Ottoman aesthetics. The covered markets and caravanserais that would make Istanbul famous were established in these early years, restoring commercial activity that had languished during the final Byzantine decades. The conquest fundamentally altered the geopolitical balance of the Mediterranean and Near East. Ottoman control of Constantinople meant control of the Bosphorus, the narrow strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. This geographical choke point had always been strategically vital, but now it was firmly in Ottoman hands, allowing Mehmed and his successors to regulate trade and troop movements between Europe and Asia. The Italian city-states that had profited from Black Sea trade found themselves paying tolls and accepting terms dictated by Ottoman authorities, a humiliating reversal for republics accustomed to negotiating from strength. More profoundly, Ottoman dominance over the traditional trade routes connecting Europe to Asia spurred Western Europeans to seek alternative paths to the spices, silks, and other luxury goods that flowed from the east. The overland routes through Ottoman territory became more expensive and less reliable for Christian merchants, creating economic incentive to find sea routes that could bypass Islamic middlemen entirely. This search for alternatives contributed significantly to the age of exploration that would characterize the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Portuguese navigators pushing down the west coast of Africa were partly motivated by the desire to reach India without crossing Ottoman lands. Christopher Columbus pitched his westward voyage to the Spanish crown partly on the premise that a new route to Asia was necessary now that the traditional paths were controlled by hostile powers. The fall of Constantinople thus played an indirect but significant role in the European discovery of the Americas. The chain of causation was complex, involving many factors beyond the events of 1453, but the Ottoman conquest certainly contributed to the maritime explorations that would connect previously isolated continents. In this sense, the siege that ended the medieval world helped catalyze the beginning of the early modern era, the age of global exploration and colonial expansion that would reshape human civilization over the following centuries. Another consequence of Constantinople's fall was the dispersal of Greek scholars and their manuscripts to Western Europe. Byzantine intellectuals who had preserved and studied classical Greek texts for centuries fled to Italy and other regions where they could find employment and safety. They brought with them expertise in Greek language and philosophy that was rare in the Latin West, where knowledge of ancient Greece had been filtered primarily through Roman intermediaries and Arabic translations. The arrival of these scholars and their books provided Western humanists with direct access to the original Greek texts of Plato, Aristotle, the Greek dramatists, historians, and poets. This influx of Greek learning accelerated the intellectual movement known as the Renaissance, which was already underway in Italy, but which received fresh impetus from the Byzantine diaspora. Universities and princely courts welcomed Greek scholars who could teach the language and explicate the classical texts. Manuscripts that had been preserved in Constantinople's libraries were sold to Italian collectors or found their way to Western institutions, expanding the textual basis for humanistic studies. The comprehensive understanding of classical civilization that would characterize Renaissance scholarship owed much to this transmission of knowledge from the dying Byzantine world to the reviving West. The symbolic significance of 1453 extended beyond its immediate political and cultural consequences. Historians would later identify the fall of Constantinople as marking the definitive end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period. This periodization was partly artificial, since historical change occurs gradually rather than at single moments, and much that was medieval persisted long after 1453, while much that was modern had begun earlier. Yet the fall of the last fragment of the Roman Empire did represent a genuine turning point, the final severing of institutional continuity with the ancient world. Constantinople had been the last direct link to classical antiquity, the city founded by Constantine the Great that had survived the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and preserved Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian theology through centuries, when Western Europe descended into fragmentation and illiteracy. With its fall, that unbroken chain of connection was severed. The Byzantine Empire had been genuinely Roman, its emperors claiming legitimate succession from Augustus, its people calling themselves Romans long after the Latin language and Italian homeland had been lost. When Constantine V died at the breach, and when Mehmed entered the Hagia Sophia, Rome truly fell for the final time, not to barbarian invasion as in 476, but to a sophisticated Islamic empire that represented a fundamentally different civilization. The fall of Constantinople also demonstrated definitively that gunpowder artillery had transformed warfare in ways that made traditional fortifications obsolete. The Theodosian Walls had been the greatest defensive works of their age, impregnable to medieval siege technology. Yet Mehmed's cannons had reduced them to rubble in 8 weeks, proving that massive bronze guns firing stone projectiles of half a ton or more could destroy any static fortification given enough time and ammunition. This lesson was absorbed by military planners throughout Europe, sparking an arms race in artillery development and a rethinking of defensive architecture. The Trace Italian fortifications that would dominate early modern warfare, with their low profiles and angled bastions designed to resist cannon fire, emerged partly in response to what had happened at Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire entered its golden age following the conquest. Mehmed II proved to be not only a conqueror, but an administrator and patron of arts and learning. He expanded the empire further, conquering the remnants of Byzantine territory in Greece, subduing the Balkans more thoroughly, and establishing Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean. His successors, particularly Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, would carry Ottoman power to its zenith, threatening Vienna and dominating the eastern Mediterranean. Istanbul became one of the world's great cities, its population exceeding 500,000, its architecture blending Islamic and Byzantine traditions into something unique and magnificent. For the Greeks who remained under Ottoman rule, the fall of Constantinople marked the beginning of centuries of subjugation that would last until the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s. The Orthodox Church survived as an institution, permitted by Ottoman authorities to administer the Christian communities according to the millet system that gave religious minorities limited autonomy in internal affairs. Yet this survival came at the cost of political powerlessness and second-class status within an Islamic empire. The dream of restoring Byzantine glory became a cultural memory rather than a realistic aspiration, kept alive in folk songs, legends like that of the Marble Emperor. and the liturgies that preserved Greek identity through centuries of foreign rule. The question that haunted subsequent generations was whether the fall had been inevitable, or whether different decisions might have saved the city. If the West had sent substantial military aid, could Constantinople have held? If the union with Rome had been accomplished earlier and more sincerely, would European princes have committed forces to the city's defense? If Constantine had accepted Mehmed's terms and surrendered peacefully, could Byzantine culture have survived in subordinate form rather than being traumatically disrupted by conquest? These counterfactuals are unanswerable but remain compelling because they probe whether the defenders were tragic heroes doomed by circumstances beyond their control or whether their choices contributed to the outcome. The reality is that Constantinople fell due to multiple factors working in combination, any one of which might have been overcome, but which together produced catastrophe. The Byzantine Empire had been declining for centuries, losing territory and resources until the capital stood isolated and vulnerable. Western Europe was divided by its own conflicts and rivalries, unable to organize effective assistance even when the strategic argument for defending Constantinople was compelling. The theological schism between Orthodox and Catholic Christianity created mutual suspicion that hindered cooperation at the crucial moment. Mehmed brought unprecedented resources and determination to the siege, employing artillery that fundamentally changed the military calculus. The defenders fought with extraordinary courage but could not overcome the mathematics of 7,000 against 80,000. Yet, if the outcome seems inevitable in retrospect, it did not feel so to those who lived through it. The defenders believed they could hold until relief arrived or until Mehmed exhausted his patience and resources. They fought for 8 weeks with the conviction that their walls, their faith, and their determination might prevail against the odds. Their resistance was not futile or foolish, but rather a testament to human capacity for hope and courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. They lost, but they lost in a manner that won them eternal honor. The legacy of 1453 lived on in memory, literature, art, and collective consciousness. For Ottoman Turks, the conquest of Istanbul became a foundational moment in national history, celebrated as the achievement that announced their emergence as a great civilization. For Greeks, the fall of Constantinople became a wound that never fully healed, a loss mourned in songs and stories passed down through generations. For Western Europeans, it served as a warning about Islamic power and a spur to the maritime explorations that would give Europe global reach. For historians, it marked a convenient boundary between medieval and modern eras, a date when one world ended and another began. The physical city survived its conquest and transformation, its walls still standing after 6 centuries, its skyline still dominated by the dome of what was once the Hagia Sophia and is now a museum. The building has outlived both the Byzantine Empire that created it and the Ottoman Empire that conquered it, a testament to the enduring power of great architecture to transcend the political arrangements of any particular age. Visitors today can walk the Theodosian Walls and imagine the defenders who died there, can stand inside the vast space of the Hagia Sophia and sense the accumulated prayers of centuries, can gaze across the Bosphorus and understand why this location mattered so profoundly to so many civilizations. Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453, ending 11 centuries of Byzantine history and closing the final chapter of the Roman Empire. The last emperor died fighting at the breach, his body lost, but his courage remembered. The great walls that had defended the city for a millennium were finally overcome by technology and determination beyond what their builders could have imagined. The civilization that fell that day had preserved and transmitted much of what Western culture values from the ancient world, serving as a bridge between classical antiquity and the modern era. Its fall marked an ending but also a transformation, the death of one world and the birth of another. The echoes of that transformation still resonate today, reminding us that empires rise and fall, that walls can be breached and cities conquered, but that ideas, art, and human courage can outlast any political arrangement and speak to us across the centuries with undiminished power.